Good morning, everyone. Hopefully you are doing well. I'm waiting a couple of minutes for everyone to join us and get settled. So I wanted to thank the IEEE Women in Leadership for hosting me on this chat. I'm really excited to do it. I'll tell you a little bit about myself before I get started. I'm an executive leadership coach and I work with senior executives, C-suite leaders, and high potentials to help them have more impact and influence in their organizations. And that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. I work with people through one-on-one coaching, group coaching, team coaching, and I also do workshops and trainings within companies throughout the Bay Area and beyond. And I've worked in companies like eBay, Cisco, Intel, Genentech, PayPal, as well as Kaiser Permanente. I have a PhD in business myself, but it was actually it was more in economics and data analysis. So I have appreciation for all that it takes to get an engineering degree and to make it your career. And I'm very respectful of that. And I hope that you're going to learn a lot that will help you further your career in the next 45 minutes. So I know that there are slides that you can follow along with, and I'll try to signal when I'm switching slides just so that you can keep up with me. So if you move to the second slide, when I'm talking with people about their career growth, I really believe that there's 4 essential components. One is, how do you lead with clarity of vision? How do you come to your vision, and then how do you inspire others to follow along with you? Then mastering the art of results. That's really mastering how you get things done yourself, productivity and time management, and through others, good delegation and leading. And then developing your influence. How can you influence and impact those around you who you might not have any direct authority over? And deepening your executive presence. How do you use your physical presence to influence and impact people and make a difference? And today what we're going to be talking mostly about is those 2 bottom circles. How do you develop your influence and deepen your executive presence? So a little bit more about my personal story. After I graduated from Yale, I went to Silicon Valley and worked for a boutique consulting firm in Silicon Valley. And I worked really hard. I got great performance reviews. And then something funny happened. I realized that some of my peers were getting promoted and I wasn't. And I felt really embarrassed. I felt ashamed and I felt confused. I didn't understand if I'd gotten such good performance reviews, why I wasn't getting promoted. And to be perfectly honest, it wasn't until a few years later, until I was doing my PhD in business, until I was studying about leadership, that I realized that while I'd been doing good individual hard work, I'd been a good individual contributor, I hadn't been managing my reputation and my visibility, both upwards and downwards in the organization. This is now something I believe that is crucial for people who want to get ahead in their career growth. So I want to give you some really actionable ways to do that today. And if you move on to slide 3, it should be a little picture of a phone. And you already have a copy of these slides, so you might not want it. But if you do want, I have a leadership assessment and an ebook on how to improve your leadership with some more actionable tips and also a little bit of an assessment. If you text career to 38470, it's a short code, but there's no charge, even if your phone pops up a message that says there might be a charge. There is no charge. And if you do that, I will send you those slides in the next day or 2. So, what are we going to talk about today? How you develop your influence, how you set up more collaborative relationships, set the right expectations, and how you expand your executive presence. How do you use your physical presence at work to be more effective? And it's really important to me that I give you strategies that you can start using right away. Because the truth of the matter is, just listening to this chat alone is not enough for you. what you need to do is start putting something into practice. And it might feel awkward at first, like you're not doing it right, like learning a new sport where you feel awkward. But the truth is that once you get through that awkward stage, it starts to feel more natural, and then it's a skill that you can really rely on. And I also want to try to be a little interactive in this chat. Jaredna, who is helping me out and is the liaison, is going to be giving me some Facebook messages on what you guys are typing into the chat bars. So however you can chat on Facebook, do it so that I can use some of your ideas as we move along. So this is actually the first question I'm going to ask you, which is, how do you like to start meetings? Or if you're not someone who starts meetings yourself, how do you like it when others start meetings? And I'll just wait a tiny bit and see if Jaredna gets any responses from you. There might be a little bit too much of a delay, so. Okay, I promise I'll come back to that. But as we move forward, I like to joke that the first 3 skills that we're going to talk about today are the skills of influence that you learn really early on in the playground, which is be nice, play fair, and know when to stand up for yourself. So if you move on to the next slide, building trust, slide number 5, you can see that many of us believe that we act a certain way in the world. We reserve judgment until we have all the facts. Everybody deserves a fair shake, or maybe even the legal maxim, innocent until proven guilty. The problem is this: our brain has a lot of default settings that often have us behave differently than how we think we would like to behave. So this is my fun geeky science slide, but when you look at the human brain, there's sort of the brain stem, which is the bottom part. The middle part, there is the limbic system. That's responsible for fight or flight and emotional responses. And then above it, that green and brown area, that's the prefrontal cortex. And that is the newest part of the brain to develop evolutionarily. And that is the part that's responsible for all higher order thinking, all rational thought, all planning. And most of us believe, especially if we're engineers, that we need to be in this logical, rational part of our brain all day at work, right? The problem is this: because the limbic system is responsible for fight or flight, it acts up in a moment. Should I stay or should I go? But the emotional control also does that, also acts in a moment. So I can't see your hands, but I'll raise my hand and say it's happened to me, where I have been in a meeting and my boss or another colleague has either put down an idea of mine or made a joke at my expense. And immediately my heart starts racing, my cheeks flush, and I think, what a jerk! I can't believe they did that. I'm so annoyed. I knew they were out to get me. And then my rational brain kicks in and I think, calm down, wait a second, that's not what they intended. But by that time, I'm so worked up that it's hard for me to relax, focus on the rest of the meeting, and listen to what's going on. People often call this limbic hijack, when your emotional response takes over. But the truth is, there's other places where your brain has default settings that determine a lot about your actions too. One thing is the friend or foe switch. And this is, and at work I like to call it colleague or competitor. And this is something where your brain has a switch, and immediately when you meet new people, you categorize them. Is it a friend or a foe? Is it a colleague or competitor? But the problem is this: your brain has a default setting to automatically categorize people as foe initially. And this makes sense because as our brains were developing, we lived in small tribal societies, so anyone new was a threat. So that made sense. But now, when we're working with people in different buildings, across the country, even across the world, a lot of people are working on virtual teams. It's really hard if every single new person that we're coming in contact, both that we're viewing them as a possible threat or competitor, and they're viewing us the same way, because you can't work collaboratively with people who are viewing you as a competitor. So if you move on to slide number 7, This is all around us. We're constantly meeting new clients and customers, whether they're internal or external, and we need to know that they are viewing us very skeptically and wondering if we are a potential threat. Similarly with promotions, maybe you're suddenly taking over a new group and it's unlikely that people there are saying, "Yay, I've got a new boss." They're worried, they're skeptical of you, they're worried about how you're a potential competitor or threat to their career. And then new team members. Whether you're the new member on the team or you're bringing new people onto your teams, it's really important to recognize that everyone on the team will have this categorization of someone as a potential threat. And until you can deal with that, people can't work collaboratively together. You can't have a high performance team when people view others as a threat. So I got a couple of answers in the box, and some people like to start meetings with an icebreaker to make everyone comfortable. That's awesome. I know a lot of people also like to start with a on time. They like to start with a good agenda. They like to have a good structure, and all of these are really important things. But it turns out that one of the most important things is whether you can have those chats and those icebreakers that people are talking about, because what flips the switch from friend to foe, from competitor to colleague, is finding people who are similar to you. Some people even like to say it as the like me or not like me switch, because once you feel that people are like you, you're more willing to open up to them. So oftentimes I'm hired by companies to work with either their high potentials or their senior leadership. And one CFO I was working with, he was smart, he was analytical, he was great at his job. But what happened is that he would go into these executive team meetings and they would be talking about things that he called airy-fairy, like branding or the mission statement for the company. And he felt like when he spoke, people would just start to roll their eyes and they didn't care what he had to say. And he started to feel literally tongue-tied and paralyzed in these meetings. He couldn't talk. And this is really important to recognize, because if it happens at the most senior level of the organizations, then you have to worry about this on all levels of the organization, no matter where you are. So what we were able to do with him was, instead of working on his meeting skills and how he was in meetings, we had him walk the company having what he called time-wasting conversations with other members of the executive team. And that allowed him to open up more about himself. "Oh, you saw that movie this weekend? I also liked that movie this weekend. Oh, your son is playing Little League this spring. So's my son." And having these conversations allowed him to build more bridges with the other members of the executive team and build alliances, so that now when he goes into these meetings, you can't shut him up. And he is really comfortable talking. And I emphasize this because people want to have influence over others they have at work, but the truth is, if people don't trust you, you can't have influence over them. So the first important part of building influence with people is building trust with those around you. And that's how you flip the switch, how you take the time to find out how you guys are more alike than that you're different, even though you might have different perspectives and different skills that you're bringing to the team that are all really important. A bonus for those of you who have employees that you manage is, with my client, we were also able to get him to stop texting his staff from meetings. He was infamous for being in a meeting, having a to-do item come up, and he just wanted his staff to get started on it right away. He was very efficient, and so he would text it out to his staff to get started. But instead, what we had him do is actually go up to people's desks, or at the very least phone them, and tell them not just what needed to be done, but why it needed to be done and why it helped the company. And in that way, you can not just build the relationships with the people that you're managing, but you can also mentor them and show them how people higher in the company think about their tasks and roles. So I'm moving on to slide number 9 now. Setting expectations. So how many of you, oh, I wish I could see hands here. I'll say me. How many of you either have kids or have heard other people's kids say, but that's not fair? Right, and as adults, what do we always respond? Life isn't fair. But the truth is, kids are saying what many of us are thinking in the workplace, which is, but that's not fair. Maybe in less of a whiny voice, though. Moving on to the next slide. It turns out, if you remember my geeky brain slide, fairness is a primary reward in the brain. That means it's really important. It's up there with food and survival, and I can be a bear if I haven't had food. So what this means is people are often willing to shoot themselves in the foot to punish those that they perceive as being unfair. And maybe there is, and maybe you've seen this before in your own work environment, where a new dictate or mandate has come down from leadership and someone has thought it was really unfair and made a big stink about it, to the point where not only were they clear that they thought it was unfair, but they were actually also hurting their own career and their reputation in the process. So imagine that you walk into a study and they tell you this is your partner and you have $100, and you can, as long as you can split this money with your partner, you can each walk out of here. So you can make your partner an offer 50-50, split the money, 90-10, and as long as your partner agrees, great. Turns out that if you offer your partner $1 and you take $99, economic rationality, if your pure rational brain, should suggest that you would take that money because you're $1 richer than you were before it started. But do we really think people would take that bet? No. It turns out that people routinely turn down offers of anything less than 70-30 because they would rather you walk out of there with nothing than that they walk out of there with less than they think they deserve. And lest you think this is just spoiled Americans who are willing to turn down money, they have taken this game, it's called the ultimatum game, on the road to third world countries, and people will turn down the equivalent of 2 weeks of salary to punish those that they perceive as being unfair. So looking at slide number 11, there are so many opportunities for people to feel that things are unfair or that there are mismatched expectations from what they expected. Favoritism is one. You might think that you're always choosing the best person for the job, but your colleagues might feel that that you're choosing unfairly and you're favoring some people over others. Similarly with bonuses and promotions, I can't tell you how many people have started coaching with me because they didn't get the bonus or promotion that they wanted, and they felt awful about it, and they wanted to make sure that it would never happen again. I wanted to give you a sense of why this can be so challenging in the workplace. So just to give you a heads up so you can start doing, you can look at slide number 13, but those are your 3 choices. And I'm going to ask you who you chose and why. So maybe Jaredna, you can start typing that in and Jaredna can signal it to me. But if you're not leading others, you just got a promotion. And if you are leading others, imagine you won a brand new high-profile project bid. And you must choose one of your team to spearhead this important project. It's a highly sought-after role on your team. So there's 3 choices. There's employee number 1, your newest team member, young and unmarried, your best producer who gets more work done effectively than any other. There's employee number 2, a solid and dependable worker of 4 years, a single parent with 2 small children who's recently been asking for a promotion. And there's employee number 3, an experienced worker who's led similar types of projects before, has worked for the company the longest, and is a few years away from retirement. So I'm hoping that I can see a little bit of what you guys would pick. So if you could type in the box here, who would you pick and why? And while I'm waiting, I'll just say for those of you who joined, if you text the word career to 38470, it's a short code, but there is no charge. I will send you not only the slides, which I think you have already, but also my leadership assessment and guide that you can then have. Okay, I'll just wait another 30 seconds to see if, I know there's a delay on this, so I apologize for the waiting, but I'd love to see who you would choose to spearhead the team. Okay, so some people are choosing employee number 2, but we don't know exactly why yet. So I'll tell you a little bit about what, when I've done this in rooms in the past and people have been able to talk to me about it. Some people have chosen employee number 1 because they feel like this person has proven themselves to have done really effective work and they're really hungry. Some people have chosen employee number 2 because they've really been asking for a promotion, so this is a chance for them to prove themselves. And some people really focus on the fact that it's a high stakes project and they really want employee number 3 because they're experienced and they've done similar types of projects before. And then some people I've found come up with combined answers. Well, I choose employee number 3 mentoring employee number 2, or employee number 3 mentoring employee number 1. And all of those are great answers. And of course, everyone wants to know at the very end, what is the answer? And the truth is, there's no right answer for who you pick, but there is a right answer, which is, if you're looking at slide number 15, is that you pre-decide how you're going to make these decisions so that you're not making them on a case-by-case basis. So maybe this means that you decide that you have to work for the company 2 years or longer before you can spearhead a project. Or maybe you always set up someone senior with someone junior to mentor on these projects so the junior people get trained along the way and get the chance to grow and prove themselves. And there are a lot of things at work that can be decided this way. How you deal with vacation during busy time periods, how you deal with if someone misses a work deadline the first time, later. And the truth is, there are endless amounts of these decisions that can be made at work, and the more that you can make them ahead of time, the more that people around you can relax and work well with each other because they know what the expectations are. They're not constantly monitoring the environment for something unfair, which is what people tend to do if they're worried that unfair things are going to be happening, and they have to look out for themselves. So whether you are the leader and you're making these decisions, or you are someone who's working for others, the more that you can clarify, the more that you can have as agreements with your manager, the more influence you have and the more control you have over your own career. So I have a reflection exercise on slide 16 that you can do after this webinar, but I'd love you to think about areas where you and your boss or manager or your team might have either unclear expectations. A great example of unclear expectations is what it takes to get promoted. I often see that people will think that it takes like X, Y, and Z to get promoted. And that's what they'll work really hard on. But their boss will really be looking for A, B, and C to really get them promoted. And if you think about my story at the beginning of the webinar, I thought that just doing great individual hard work was what it would take to get promoted. But it turns out my companies were looking for me to take leadership in different directions than I had up to that point. Similarly with conflicting expectations. Here in the Bay Area where I'm located, there are a lot of flexible work arrangements or even work from home telecommuting arrangements. And oftentimes one person might think, oh, well, as long as I get my work done and it's really high quality work, it doesn't matter when I do it or where I do it. And their manager might be thinking, where is this person? I never see them in the office. When I call them, it takes them a couple of hours to get back to me. I feel really frustrated that they're not that they're not available to me the way I'd like them to be. That can be a really good example of conflicting expectations. But there's a lot of this as well. Perhaps you're working hard on something and your boss dropped something new on your desk, and so you and said, "Oh, can you do this? I'm so sorry to ask you, but I don't have anyone else to ask." So immediately you start working on the new project, and then the next day they're asking, "Where's that project I wanted from you?" And you said, "Well, you dropped that thing on my desk. I thought you wanted that." And they said, "No, I just thought that you would do that when you were done with the other project." So that's an example. Similarly, unstated expectations. I've talked to so many leaders who don't even think that the people below them want a promotion because they haven't advocated for it, they haven't asked for it, where the person just thinks it's a meritocracy, and if I do good work and I'm doing, great things, then obviously I should get promoted. So those are great unstated expectations. But I'd love you to think about, what is one expectation that you want to make clear and stated between you and your boss or you and your team, so that you have a clear understanding with each other. Moving on to slide 17. The truth is that we've talked about great things to do to build up shared expectations and to build up trust so that you have better relationships with people at work, because until you have those better relationships, it's really hard to have influence with people at work. And with these better relationships, people stay more engaged, they're more collaborative on teams, and they're more productive towards each other. But now I want to turn to how you can show up better as a leader, so more on executive presence. So a lot of people believe, I'm looking at slide 18 now, a lot of people believe that they're, two very well-known leadership styles: command and control. I say it, you do it, preferably exactly how I want it done. Or everyone's favorite boss: if I'm nice and you like me, you'll work harder for me. And what I want to argue here today is that the most effective leaders don't have to choose between these two or any other leadership style, but that they have versatility and they can move between these leadership styles and use whatever is right at that moment to give them the most influence. So only 7% of the impact that you have on others is the words you say. The rest is your body language and your tone of voice. And now I'm looking at slide number 20. And I don't know about you, but initially this can strike you as sort of counterintuitive, right? Because if you have a big presentation, what are you practicing? You're practicing your words, your arguments, how you're going to convince people. And it's not that that doesn't matter. It does, because when you work on that 7% of your words, it starts to filter out as you get more confident into your body language and your tone of voice. But what I often say to my clients is, let's start getting some of the benefit of that 93% right away. And let's start working on your body language and tone of voice so that you come across as more powerful and you can have more impact to affect others right away than just the 7% of the words you say. The truth is that as humans, we are pack animals. So we are constantly looking to others to see where we fit in the social hierarchy. And that's why some people wear certain brand name clothes or drive certain brand name cars. It's one way of signaling to others where they think they fit in the hierarchy. But I believe at work that our confidence is what signals to others where we fit in the hierarchy. So I know that there's a little bit of a delay on the slide, so I won't be able to see all your answers before I move on. But if you look at slide number 22, I'd love you to say, like, what looks like the more powerful positions here? The truth is that there are higher power behaviors and lower power behaviors. And higher power behaviors signal your expert status, your competence, your confidence. And lower power behaviors signal your likability and are great for building trust. So one client I have, she's a CEO of a venture-funded company here in Silicon Valley. And she really wanted to have a very collaborative, equal, very little hierarchy work environment. She wanted to work super collaboratively with her team. But what would happen is, after a while, she would start to feel like people weren't listening to her, they weren't following her direction, and that they were taking advantage of her. And sometimes she would even lose it and start to yell at people. So when I talk about high power and low power, that's not moving between those two. That is just blowing a fuse. But what we were able to do is have her use more of the higher power behaviors when she wanted to set the strategy for her team, set the mission for her company, and then use more of the lower power behaviors when she was going to work collaboratively with them together as a team to implement the strategies that she had come up with. So that's a great way where someone can move between those two extremes. So if you're looking at slide number 22, A, D, and F, are the more high power positions. So higher power positions are when you have more expansive posture. You literally take up more space. When you talk to people, you look directly at them, and also that when you speak, you tend to have a lower tone of voice. Lower power positions are when you're more narrow, you take up less room, that you smile a lot, that when other people are talking, you nod to show you're agreeing, and that when you're talking, you're constantly looking out into the room or the audience to figure out if they're agreeing with you. Those are all lower power behaviors. So I'm on slide 23 now. I don't know how many of you have seen Amy Cuddy's TED Talk, but I always just put it on my slides because oftentimes when I'm in rooms, only 10 or 20% of people have seen this TED Talk, and it is great and a worthwhile 20 minutes of your life. But she talks about power posing like this little Wonder Woman girl with, the hands on the hips. That's one of the power poses. And one of the things that she talks about is how having these more expansive, these more powerful poses, it doesn't just change how people perceive you, but it also changes your hormone levels so that you feel less stressed and you feel more powerful when you're in these positions. Now, a lot of people will say to me, well, if playing high gets you confidence, competence, and expert status, why would you ever want to play low? But the truth is, we don't like people who play high all the time. We find them to be puffy, they're full of themselves. Oh, they think they're so much better than I am all the time. But that what gives people charisma is that when they can switch between, building relationship, playing low, building their likability, or stepping back and letting others take the lead, versus playing high and, taking control or trying to master the situation themselves. That's an important part of charisma. And then I wanted to go over how you might use these things about presence in meetings that you're at to come across more effectively. So slide number 24. One of the most important things is to have some time to prepare before the meeting. I find so many people are rushing into meetings, they're looking into their phone, and work is busy, and they're checking messages, they're listening to voicemails as they're walking into the meeting. But the truth is, it's when you take a moment, you go to the bathroom before a meeting, you just breathe, maybe you even take your Wonder Woman pose, that you can walk into the meeting more confidently and with more presence. Because if you're scattered and sort of out, not focused, you don't have the executive presence you want in the meeting. And similarly, think a little bit about the conversation that's going to be happening in the meeting. What are your talking points? What are the questions you'll get? One leader I worked with, she was super smart, but she would tend to get ruffled by questions, especially too many of them. She was more introverted and she had an outgoing team, and she would start to feel very flustered. And so if you're not prepared for what the questions are people are going to be asking you, you might come across as flustered and defensive, which is what she did initially until we worked together. Then using your presence in meetings, during the meetings, think about how you want to come across in your body language. When you're hunched over a computer or you're hunched over notes writing, you have much more lower power body positioning, and it doesn't portray your confidence or put you into the meeting as well. Similarly, your voice, something that a lot of people do these days, but more often women, is that their voices go up at the end of the sentence. So it sounds like they're asking a question, even when they're not. So if you know you're someone who tends to do that, watch that in yourself. Similarly, you want to avoid filler statements, like, and I do those myself. I've probably even done a few of them during this presentation. So I know they can happen. It's not that you need to be perfect about it, but you don't want to be someone who's throwing them in every other sentence. Similarly, if you feel like you need to use them a lot, that's a great time to pause and just gather your own thoughts before you start speaking, rather than umming until you figure out what you're going to say. And then be present. If you are surreptitiously checking your cell phone during a meeting, if you're fiddling with a button on your jacket, or if you're staring out the window, then you do not have executive presence in this meeting. You have to physically be present, be focused on the meeting to have executive presence. If your mind is elsewhere, you don't have it. And then lastly, I think this is really important to talk about, especially with a female audience, but dressing for executive presence, because very few people will give you feedback on your appearance. Right now, with sexual harassment, with fears of being inappropriate, people don't like to comment on other people's appearance. But even though appearance is only 5% of executive presence, it can be a minimum hurdle to overcome. So in other words, if you don't have the right appearance, oftentimes you won't get promoted. And I have stories from HR people and other leaders about someone who was doing a great job, but they just didn't look client ready. So until they had a makeover and appeared more client ready or more authoritative, they didn't feel like they could be promoted into the next level of their job. So what I always talk about with people is the sort of my top do's are to make sure your clothes are well fitting, that they don't fit 2 sizes ago from when you've lost or gained weight. You don't want to be hiking up your pants or having to, pull on a shirt that's too tight. What you wear should be adding to your confidence, and it shouldn't be making you feel weird by having to hike up your pants all the time before it falls off. Similarly, you also don't want to seem tired. I know a lot of people think, oh, if I'm tired, that shows how hard I'm working. It's a sign of my dedication to the work. But what it's also showing people is that you're overwhelmed with your current workload. So if you look tired, you don't look well rested, you haven't had time to work out in a long time, what you're really signaling to people is you don't have time for more responsibility of a promotion. And then I always say to pay attention to your surroundings, because what the hoodies and casual wear that is fine in Silicon Valley would be really inappropriate in most East Coast workplaces. And similarly, if you wear one of the suits from the East Coast to a Silicon Valley company that's all casual, you'll look sort of uptight and out of place. So try to figure out what are others around you wearing? What's the norms in where you are? And then you can decide if you want to follow those norms or not. But at least be aware of what those norms are so that you can decide if you want to stand out and take that risk, or if you want to sort of blend in with people and have the common executive presence of where you're looking at. And as we move into before questions, I wanted to give you one other exercise that I hope you will do after the webinar, which is let's plan for some future success so that you use some of the skills you've learned today. So next week, what's one important meeting you have? Or it's Tuesday, so maybe this week, what's one important meeting you have? What do you need to accomplish? Do you need to build up your competence, demonstrate it? Do you need to create likability, build trust with someone? Or are you setting expectations? Maybe you have to have that talk with your boss that we talked about earlier on setting expectations about what comes next for you. And what body language cues can you practice from this talk? Maybe you want to have a more expansive posture. Maybe you're building likability and want to come in playing more low. Are there any other strategies from the talk that you want to practice in the next week so that you can give yourself some support to try these new behaviors, as I've said before? So I'm on slide 28 now, But I wanted to make an offer to you, which is if you are listening to this and you're thinking, oh, these are great strategies and I want to put them into practice and even more into practice because I'm someone who wants to get there as fast as possible. Or if you are listening to this and you're thinking, I know what's going well in my career and I know there's one particular thing that if I could solve that, it would make a huge difference in my career, then let's talk. I offer a complimentary 45-minute telephone session, and what we'll talk about is what is your next level career success? What are the challenges standing between you and getting there? And how can we start to shift those and think about those differently so that you can have more of the career success you want? So just because I have a limited number of these slots, if you're interested, you can fill out a form at, it's a Google form at bit.do career webinar, and then I'll get back to you and we can schedule some times to talk. And so soon I will be moving into questions, but I wanted to close with this quote from Peter Drucker. He was one of the most famous management experts. And he said, only 3 things happen naturally in organizations: friction, confusion, and underperformance. Everything else requires leadership. So I hope that today you've gotten some great ideas for how you can up your leadership in your organization. And now I'm on the last slide, questions. But once again, I know you have my workshop slides, but if you would like my leadership booklet and assessment, then just text career to 38470. And someone was just asking for the link to the Google form, and it's bit.do/career webinar, all one word, but it's also on the slides if you look on the slides. So now I have some questions that have been popping into the box while I've been talking, so I'm just going to go back and look at them. So give me a moment while I look at them. Okay, this is a great question. Someone wrote, as far as communication is a key point in leadership, how can a shy person be a leader? And that's both a great question, and yes, it can be a little bit more challenging if you are a shy person. I have worked with a lot of introverted leaders. I find that people who tend to be more analytical. It's not always as a rule, but they're often a little bit more introverted. And I think that there's a really big difference between being a shy person and being an introvert. I think it is very hard to be a leader if you are reluctant to talk to people. And when I think of shy, I think about people who are reluctant to talk to people. And my husband was a shy person. We have stories about him hiding under the table at his birthday parties when he was a kid, when people were singing happy birthday to him. So I know that can be really overwhelming. But what he worked on himself was how he could stand up in front of a room, how he could still talk to people, even being shy. So I think if you are someone that is shy, it's important to make a distinction between, okay, I would prefer to have some more time on my own, but I can go out to people, I can talk to them, because it's hard to be a leader who can't reach out to the people around you, who can't engage them, who can't inspire them. So maybe you can sort of work to get over the shyer part of yourself so that you can more easily reach out to people, but you don't have to give up that part of yourself that still prefers a little more peace and quiet versus being the life of the party. I don't think you need to be the life of the party to be a leader, but you have to be willing to put yourself out there and reach out to others. So I hope that answers your question. Someone asked, does every manager need to be a leader? And no, that is not true. This is a good question. When I think of a manager, I think of someone who manages others well. And if you're managing others, then I think you need to show some leadership and some initiative. Does that mean you need to be leading the company? Does that mean you want to be in charge at the upper echelon of the company? No, but I do think that a lot of the skills that good leaders have, good managers also have, which is that they can build trust with others, that they know when to wield their authority and their expert status and when to step back and let their employees sort of show what they have, show their stuff. and show what they can do. So I don't think a manager is just someone who can delegate well, but I think there has to be some inspiration along the way so that you're getting the best work out of others. And I think that kind of inspiration and that kind of tapping in at the best in others is true leadership. Someone asked, what's the worst fault a leader can have? That is a great question, and I'm not sure that I could say, but I could talk about what are some really challenging faults. I think that there are some leaders and, who have been narcissistic. So you can be a great leader and be narcissistic, but I think it's a much harder battle. So I think if you care genuinely about others, it makes it much easier to be a leader because people sense that caring and they respond to it. I think though, if I look at someone like Steve Jobs, he was probably relatively narcissistic. He was a difficult person to work for many people, but he was incredibly inspiring. So what he was able to do was tap into like others' desires to really change the world. So I think if you have a great vision and you can inspire others to follow that vision, then a lot of personal faults can be forgiven. But I think if you're an amazing person, but you have no vision, then it's a lot harder then it's also really hard to be a leader. So I think you either have to really dominate one or the other or have some good mix of them. And okay, I'm just looking at the questions again. And thank you for Carla and some other people who answered the employee question. Sorry, it took a while to get in there. Can someone be a good leader but not a good manager? Which is better for the company? Yes, I think someone can be a good leader and not a good manager, and I'll explain what I mean about that. I think that there are people, Steve Jobs, he's a total archetype, so I'm using him as an extreme example. But someone who has an amazing vision, someone who really inspires others, that might be someone who's a great leader, but he wasn't particularly a good manager in terms of, getting people, in having good one-on-one relationships with people. Well, he did have some. Okay, forget the Steve Jobs thing. I think you can be someone who can lead a company, who can see a lot of potential, who can inspire others, but you're not someone maybe who manages others well. So you delegate and you don't really follow up with people. You're almost the opposite of a micromanager. You sort of leave your people on their own. That kind of person is not a great manager. I have one client I was working with, and she could never get any FaceTime from her manager. He was always too busy. He was always working on other things, and it was incredibly frustrating for her. And so I think in that way, he was not a great manager for her because he couldn't give her personal guidance. He couldn't help her see where her growth areas are. He couldn't sort of bring out the best in her. But he might be a good leader in the company in terms of taking his whole division where it needs to go, generally inspiring the teams. But I think people who are good managers can also grow the people underneath them, through more mentorship as well. Someone is asking for the link for the Google form. I think I gave that, and it's on the slides, but bit.do/career leader webinar. And how do you get your manager to accept your ideas? Great question. I always tell my clients that most people are tuned into the WIFM station, which is what's in it for me station. So if you want your manager to accept your ideas, you really need to be tuned into their station of what's in it for them. And one thing people often bring is they often bring great ideas, and they can explain why they're great ideas, but they can't really explain why it's worth it for their manager to take their precious time, because none of us have very much extra time these days. All of us are busy. All of us are overwhelmed or overtaxed at work. So why is it worth it for your particular manager to take their time to implement your idea. So you have to really show like what's the growth potential in it for them. Maybe they can come in under budget if they use your idea and they'll have more money for other things they want. Or maybe it will make your department much more a model of efficiency, and then that will make them look really good in the eyes of more senior leadership because they've implemented a ton of efficiency or a new process in their department that is cutting edge. But I think a lot of people go into discussions like this, well, it's the right thing to do, or this is a good idea. But you have to really convince this person why it's the right thing for them to do right now, because there's so much else pulling on them. And a lot of people feel like, well, if I can't get my basic job done, I can't really work on these niceties that would be great to have until I have the must-haves. So it's sort of like how you convince your manager that this is a must-have versus would be nice to have. And if that didn't answer your question, you can type in some more and I'm happy to go further into that. What's the most difficult part of being a leader? Well, I mean, probably some of you on here are leaders, so I wish I could ask you and you could tell what is the most difficult part of being a leader. But from my work with leaders, what I often hear is the most difficult part is being pulled in so many different directions, and also not being able to always do your best work because you are being pulled in multiple directions. A lot of working moms, for instance, that I talk with, they feel like they're not doing a great job at home because, they're constantly busy and worried about work and checking into emails when they're home or on their BlackBerry or iPhones. I guess no one uses BlackBerries anymore. Or they are at work and then, they get a call from the school or something's going on and then they're worried who's going to pick up their kid and how are they going to deal with this issue that is happening at home. So that is just one example of how people feel split that is pretty common. But I think most leaders feel really split in terms of how do they pitch their ideas to senior management? How do they get their own visibility? Then how do they mentor their employees? How do they grow them? A, so that they're just doing a competent job in the beginning, but then B, a lot of really good leaders want to invest in their team and they want their team to grow too. So how do they have the time to really mentor people underneath them? And then there is just, honestly, when I talk with a lot of leaders, they're worried just about getting their job done. Like I've coached several CFOs and they have a team that they're managing. So there's the whole management part of the team, but then there's their own work of sitting there, looking at the budget, running the numbers, making sure things work. And that takes time and focus and concentration. And when you have a bigger team and people are always asking you for things and you have other departments asking you is their budget for this and calling on you, it's hard to even find the time for the bare minimum of your own work that needs to get done so that you do your job. So I think that is one of the hardest things about being a leader. I think the other really hard part about being a leader, and this is a little bit more theoretical, but is that there is a lot of complexity out in the world these days and a lot of uncertainty. And if you're the leader, you're often trying to stay ahead of the uncertainty, stay ahead of the complexity, figure out the best strategy, even with all the unknowns. And a lot of times there really isn't a best strategy, or you'll never know if it was the best strategy or not. So I think our leaders are often living with a ton of uncertainty and not knowing if they're doing the right thing. That doesn't mean they can't confidently put it forward, but they're not sure. Deep in their own mind when they go home and they're talking to their spouse and they're, flip-flopping at night, they don't know, are they really doing the right thing for their division, for their company, for their group? Okay. I hope that was helpful. That was a really fun question to think about and answer. Is competition among a team healthy? Why or why not? That is a good question, and it sort of depends what you are trying to get out of your team. And I'll explain a little bit more. I think for sales teams, people use a lot of competition. And for sales, often that makes sense because people are sort of individual contributors themselves, but they are, but all of their numbers are contributing to the team numbers. But if you can play people in competition with each other, then for the most part, if they don't need each other, it works okay. Although, you can see on Wall Street, sometimes it goes really awry, but in terms of ethics. But if you have a team that you need them to work collaboratively, that you want them to be a high performing team that works together, then no, I don't think competition between the team members is healthy. Do I think it's healthy to have competitive team members who want to do their best? Yes. I think there are a lot of high performers at work who are just very internally motivated and internally competitive with themselves. But I think that when it starts feeling like it's me or them, and if you have that feeling on your team, then it's really hard to work productively because it's hard to give credit to other people. It's hard to bring people in when you know that their guidance is needed, because then you might have to admit they helped you and you didn't do it on your own. And then you're not getting the true potential of a team. Really healthy, high performing teams, those are ones in which really the sum of the parts the sum of everything together, them together is much bigger than the sum of the parts. So that because they're brainstorming, they're bouncing ideas off each other, they're motivating each other, they're all of their inner competitiveness with their own self is like taking the game to a higher level. I think that is a great high performing team. But I think if they're sort of looking over their shoulder and feeling like someone might be not having their back, then you don't get that collaboration. You don't get people helping each other, people pitching in just to make a colleague look good. Like maybe, someone says, I'm drowning in this report. Can you help me? If you have competitiveness between the team members, they're not going to help. But if you have this feeling that the whole team sinks or swims together, then it will be helpful. I don't know how many of you read, there was an article in the New York Times by Charles Duhigg, maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And he talked about a lot of the research that's coming out of Google on what makes a team high performing. And none of this research is, to be honest, that new, or at least what was in this article. It's stuff that we've known all along. But one of the things that he really came up with, the most high performing teams have safety. So you feel safe within that team. And I think if you have too much competitiveness between the team members, there isn't safety there. Okay, here's another question. How can we say our manager... someone wrote, how can we say our managers what they're speaking is wrong in a positive way? Oh, okay. So I think what I'm reading is, how can we tell our managers that something that they're saying is wrong, but say it in a nice way? So it really depends on if you're talking about like, are they giving a talk or a presentation and you're hearing and some piece of information that they're giving is wrong? How do you correct them in front of the room? That is hard. That is really hard. It's hard to correct someone in front of the room without looking like you're one-upping them. And if that's your manager, especially so. So probably if it were me, I would not say anything at the time unless it became really important to the discussion. And then I might say something like, I'm not positive that I'm right about this, but this is one thing I wanted to put forward. But I'd put it forward in a really, in a very mild way if it's in front of others. If you're speaking with your boss one-on-one and he is saying something that is just wrong, like about your performance, well, you didn't turn this in on time, and you're like, well, no, actually I did, then I think the best thing you can do is be really calm. If you go back to that brain slide, when you start to get emotional, there's these mirror neurons in people. So you get emotional and then they get emotional. And then it stops being a calm, positive conversation. And it starts being one where people feel very emotional and under attack or defensive. So I think, sort of instead of saying things like, I respectfully disagree, because that's sort of saying you're wrong, I might say things like, well, that's not how I see it. I think it's really important to look at this as well. And so I might sort of phrase things in the positive that way, as opposed to putting as opposed to making someone else wrong for you to be right? Like, is there a way that you can talk about them with it that you can both be right? Like, oh, I see your point. One thing I wanted to bring up is this, though. I call it the yes and. Instead of saying no, but it's sort of yes, that's true, and this is also true. And I'll just say one quick thing before we wrap up, which is I know in that last question I gave, I felt like I gave a lot of apologetic language. And that is because I think when you're telling someone they're wrong, you probably want to do that as subtly as possible. But I do know that it is a big deal for women in the workplace to use more apologetic language, and that comes across as less powerful. So there's actually a Google app, a Gmail app, you can find it, I don't remember the name, but it will actually highlight the forms in your emails when you keep saying, well, I'm not sure about this, but, or I hate to bother you, but, those type of apologetic statements that tend to be more common for women. So you might want to check that out if you're interested in that. This was a real pleasure. I wish I could have heard your voices or seen your faces, but you guys were awesome to talk with. You had amazing questions, and I hope that we can continue the conversation. So, I hope you'll visit my website, successreboot.com. I hope you'll, text career to 38470 and, and you get my leadership report, or that you'll sign up to talk with me, bit.do/career webinar. And thank you, Jaredna. This was really fun and awesome. So I'm going to sign out now.